So welcome everyone. Today we are joining you from the Turrbal and Yagara country. We're hosting our webinar from here, and that is in QUT in Brisbane. We will now play a short acknowledgement to country. Thank you, Sharon.
QUT acknowledges the First Nations owners of the lands on where we gather today and pay our respects to the elders, laws, customs and creation spirits of this country. For thousands of years, the First Nations owners have gathered to share their knowledge and stories. We pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and acknowledge the important role they play within our communities. We recognise their long and continuing connection to country, the lands, winds and waters throughout Australia. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, researching and learning.
Thank you, Sharon. If you would like to share with us in the chat where you are joining us from today, that would be lovely as well. So my name is Karen Wynn and I'm one of the Learning and Development Coordinators here at PCC4U QUT in Brisbane. And today joining us is our wonderful National Program Manager, Kylie Ash, and also joining us is the delightful Sharon Wetzig, my fellow Learning and Development Coordinator. So thank you. So today, what were we talking about? We're talking about a number of topics regarding the delivery of simulation. I'm also looking forward to sharing with you the simulation guide. We'll go through a few little concepts in that guide and just it has launched now on our LMS, and so I'd like to introduce that to you. So simulation is such a huge topic. So for today, I'll be focusing on two distinct things. Firstly, we're going to be looking at the development of novice facilitators delivering sim. So really what I mean by that is identifying what is important to get right with our practice from the start so that we deliver safe, powerful learning moments. And secondly, this brings me to my second topic, is really looking at and breaking down into smaller parts the concept of psychological safety and what that really does mean for our participants and for us as faculty delivery. I'm so looking forward to sharing with you some question and answer time I recently had with two experts in the field of simulation. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Jenny Rudolph, who is the Executive Director for Simulation at the Centre for Simulation in Boston. So that's a very big title. And Jenny will be sharing her advice on how best to develop faculty to become great simulation leaders. Jenny has a long history in simulation and faculty development and has written a number of seminal pieces of work around how to ensure great experiences for participants in simulation and how that ultimately comes from the development of ourselves as faculty. I will also be talking with Stephanie Barwick. Stephanie is the Director for Partnerships and Programs at Mater Education here in Brisbane. And Steph is a Sim Fellow and she studied at the Centre for Simulation in Boston as well. Steph will be having a chat and sharing her advice on creating psychological safe environments for your learners and the risks if this does not occur. So moving forward, let's hear from Dr. Jenny Rudolph with her thoughts on why it's so important to invest in our faculty or ourselves to make sure that we have the right people in the roles of delivery. Thank you, Sharon. So thank you, Jenny, so much for coming and talking to us today. It's absolute privilege to have your time. And I've been a very big fan of yours for a very, very long time. And I'm so privileged that I got to meet you and see the body of work that you've done. And I'm always coming across new things that you're working on. And one of the things I'd really like to talk to you about today is the development of faculty to deliver simulation. There's quite a few different questions I'd like to ask you about that to get your perspective and advice. So one prong will be about facilities role or leadership's role in identifying what is needed to what you need to foster in a clinician to run simulation really well and safely. And then the other prong I'd like to talk to you about is, as a clinician who's been asked to run sim or it's part of my work role, what are some of the self-reflection things I should be really thinking about before I step into that room?
Thank you, Karen, so much for having me. It's a joy to be here with you, and those are topics I'm very passionate about, so looking forward to the dialogue.
Thank you. I think that was one of my first questions I wanted to ask, so our listeners could just know a little bit more about you, is just what got you in, not what got you, but what made you so passionate about simulation? Was there a triggering moment that you thought, right, that's it, I've got to go in and change things, or did you just enjoy it? So what brought you into this world of simulation as such?
Well, I ironically got into healthcare simulation via sports simulation. So
Right.
I
Yeah.
rowed crew on the US rowing team many years ago, and we would videotape our trainings and we would analyze them and we would talk about them. And I realized it's so amazing that you can get to practice something and get better at it.
Mm,
And when I left the US team, I realized, wow, this would be so great if we could do it for something in real work or real that had real consequences in the everyday.
mm,
So I sort of started a hunt over several years to look for something. And after some fairly significant amount of time, I stumbled upon healthcare simulation. And I ended up finding out about it because I wanted to study medical error. And medical
all right.
error is vanishingly rare,
Mm,
fortunately.
mm,
So instead of standing around a hospital for hours and hours and hours waiting for those very, very rare medical errors, one of my mentors said, hey, listen, medical simulation, they have a lot of challenges, healthcare simulation, interprofessional teams. There's a lot going on, and you'd likely to see more mistakes more frequently because they're very difficult challenges that people need to practice, and therefore they're likely to work at the edge of their expertise and make some mistakes.
yes.
So
Yeah.
I started studying it for my doctoral dissertation and just absolutely fell in love with the whole process, and eventually got recruited to where I am now at the Center for Medical Simulation associated
Oh,
with Mass
what an int-
General,
yeah.
Harvard Medical School. Yeah.
What an interesting journey. You probably never thought when you're in the rowing that this is where you would end up. So thank you so much. So as I mentioned, I have the two-pronged approach I'd like to talk to you about. And so the first question would really be, or second question would really be about, do you think there's often an assumption that because you are a high performing clinician, that you will then naturally be, and this is assumption sometimes made by perhaps leadership, that you will be the right person to manage sim, run sim, and train staff through the simulation process? Do you think that that is a common assumption that is made?
I think there are many healthcare professions programs that do assume that a
Yeah.
talented clinician is automatically a talented teacher of any sort.
Mm,
And by the way, I don't think healthcare is the only profession guilty of this. I trained in a management school and I was thrown into teaching undergraduate students business courses. My program, fortunately, did actually give me some teaching training, but lawyers, doctors,
mm,
nurses, management people, everybody is often assumed to be able to teach. So I don't think the healthcare professionals should be held to a higher standard than all the rest of us.
yeah.
That being said, just because you are a talented clinician does not necessarily make you a talented instructor, educator, facilitator, and especially in the simulation context, which has particular psychological safety risks that
Mm.
other settings don't.
Yes, I agree. And I guess that helps to answer my next question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think is the most dangerous mistake a facility can make when asking a staff to run or manage simulations when they're perhaps not thought about the psychological safety of staff, or they haven't thought about the training that that person's had? So what do you think is the most dangerous mistake they could be making there?
When we ask people to step into a simulation, we are asking them to put their current professional capabilities on display.
Mm,
And
mm, mm,
often their preceptor is watching them, occasionally their peers are watching them. And so that performance, if we can call it that, and I don't mean they're acting,
mm,
is under scrutiny. And it's usually under scrutiny when you're working already at the edge of your expertise. What we know is if I'm doing something I'm really good at, I probably don't need to simulate it that much. But if I'm working at the edge of my expertise, it's highly likely I'll make a mistake.
Mm.
If I then, for whatever reason, am made to feel shamed or humiliated for having made that mistake, a couple bad things happen. One is I start distrusting my educational context because my educational context doesn't keep me from feeling shame and humiliation. And that might leak out into other areas where I'm also going to not trust my instructors or professors.
Yeah.
But the other more important thing is that it could anchor a feeling of self doubt in an area where, yes, maybe I want to feel a little bit doubting. I should explore things a little more fully, but sorry, I need to learn a bit more. But if I have too much self doubt, then I might choose to leave the profession, or that might be one of the bricks in the wall of making me leave the profession. And we know that in this peri-pandemic period where everybody's feeling very pressed, some people are very burnt out, it's not an added injury or assault that we want to add to any of our newly training nurses, paramedics, doctors.
Excellent. That's right.
And if I could just summarize the two main points we've discussed, because I
Sure.
know I've said quite a few words. So one is, you asked what's the riskiest or most dangerous thing?
Yes.
I really talked about one thing, which is harming psychological safety, which is the learner's perception that this is a safe environment for risk taking in the service of learning.
Definitely.
That is, if I speak up or I say I don't know or I make a mistake, I will not be humiliated. So it's dangerous when people do not feel psychologically safe. So that's thing one. Thing two, let me not forget this though, is actual physical safety is incredibly important in simulation. So that getting a stick, a needle stick wound or other accidental harms to the learners can actually happen. And so how we set up the environment safely is incredibly crucial.
Yes.
For the learners. But the other thing is, if we're setting up in situ simulations or any kind of simulation where the medications or the equipment or the needles could migrate from the sim environment back into the real environment, that is a true risk. And patients have been harmed and even killed by those kinds of breaches. So I wanted to just highlight physical and psychological safety.
Yeah. What advice do you have who's coming in to run their first few sims? They're a great clinician, they've got good background as a teacher, and they're a kind, listening, curious person. So we've got that type of person in the right person in the right job, hopefully. What just a couple of words of advice?
Sure. I think one of the best things that novice simulation instructors can do for themselves is to participate in someone else's simulation a couple times. So go to a neighboring university, go to a neighboring nursing school, go to a neighboring paramedicine program and participate in the simulation. Ask to participate. And notice what makes you excited, what makes you engaged, what makes you feel threatened, what makes you feel bored, because that gut visceral sense of what's landing as fair and well designed on you is going to be incredibly important. There's no substitute for knowing how simulation lands on you personally. So I know that's a little unusual, but having a more experienced simulation person run a sim that you can participate in, I think would be great.
So that's good advice in the beginning. I think that's excellent. So what would you say if I, and we do see this a little bit, if I am in a simulation and I'm a co-simulator, a co-faculty member, if I see a colleague deliberately go rogue when running a simulation to challenge the students, sometimes you see people get a bit of a buzz from really challenging and switching it up and perhaps losing sight of the objectives.
Karen, this is a tricky one because so in my view, the instructor's somewhat sacred duty is to maintain a psychologically safe space for people to work together. And so if one instructor is landing hard on the learners and the other instructor just stands by and says nothing, they are modeling not speaking up about a practice that is harmful,
safe.
harmful to the learner. So I think that if I'm with someone who's acting in a way that's not psychologically safe for the learners, it's incumbent on me to deal with that in some way.
Yep.
And at the very least, to say, hey, Karen, listen, could we just press pause for a minute on this debriefing? There's something I'd love to explore with you. I know this is a little unusual, but could we just step outside for a moment? That way,
Right.
I don't have to dress you down in front of the learners as possible. The other thing is I could try to take the conversation back, and I could just say, hey, Karen, let me just hold us on that topic for a moment if I'd like to move back to this. So I'm not going to name it explicitly. So this is very important to prevent rather than deal with in the moment. So I really should have started with this. Prevention is key. So I would meet with my co-facilitator ahead of time and just say, hey, we need a way to manage if one of us is going zigging when the other one thinks we should be zagging.
That's excellent. What reflection do you suggest facilitators after the participants have left? Because sometimes you're beating yourself up about how it went and you didn't think it went very well and you feel like you failed in the sim.
So I think if they're doing any kind of reflection, either self-reflection or working with others, kudos to them.
Okay.
Lots of people don't even try.
Okay.
So I support the idea of even a 90-second or 2-minute, how did that simplest debrief go? What are some pluses? What are some deltas? What could we do better next time? With whatever level of expertise I have at the moment, whatever the instructor expertise is at the moment. But Karen, as you know, as an experienced nurse, you will do better in such a reflection if you had a more advanced colleague or somebody who really knows what they're talking about to help you reflect on what happened in the management of that patient. So you can reflect till the cows come home, as we say here in the States, but if you don't have the expertise to know how to fix it or what were the important things, you're not necessarily going to get better.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
So again, I think that certainly peer mentoring is better than no mentoring, usually.
Yep.
But if you could have someone who's, you're a yellow belt in simulation and that person's a green belt in simulation, if you can get somebody to give you a little guidance who's got a little more acumen, I think that's really great.
Yeah.
And sometimes people just don't have that at their own home institution. So increasingly, there are communities of practice, groups of people, the Australian Simulation Society or the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, which is the International Simulation Society, all have listservs and groups where people can write and say, hey, this happened, what would you recommend? So tapping into the broader community, I think, would also be a way to go.
Yes, and I absolutely love on the Centre for Simulation's website the podcasts. I've been listening to quite a few, and the Simulation Fail series is amazing. And you just think these people are top of their field, best of the best, and they've all experienced the same things that perhaps I have. And so I will be making sure our listeners have access to that and guiding them to where to find these things, because it makes you feel like, okay, I am human. We have all made the same mistakes. Thank you. I think one of the last questions just about self-reflection of faculty is, if you do get and I have listened to this in a number of the podcasts on your website, if you get negative feedback from participants, how do you not take it too personally? How can you grow from that? And I have listened to podcasts where the staff member said, the participants said, oh, that was just too basic. It was too easy. There was too many people in there. None of us got a turn to do whatever we want, and it just totally bombed. And that's because that person was trying to be very inclusive and let everybody in and be part of it. And they since realized, okay, well, that's not always ideal to have too many participants. But in the moment, felt very, very, impacted by the negative feedback. Is what can you do? And I know you have to get a thick skin in this job. I do get that. But what can you do reflection wise to manage that when you might get a run of negative feedback? So what can you suggest?
So I think The book Thanks for the Feedback. The book Thanks
Yes.
for the Feedback by the same people who wrote Difficult Conversations has some wonderful guidance on this,
Sure.
which is often when we get feedback, it really stings. I tried so hard to set up this simulation. I worked so hard, and now you're telling me it was basically rubbish. What I have to do there, like almost any feedback situation, is find a way to temporarily reset myself so that I can at least get the benefit of the feedback. So what I do in that situation, and any situation, because feedback stings me just as much as the other people, is I say to myself, okay, yes, this is really hurting my feelings right now, and I feel embarrassed, or I feel whatever, but these people have some insights for me that can help right now, and I have them for 5 more minutes. So I just try to say, hey, listen, I'm so sorry that didn't land the way that you wanted. I'd like to make it really better the next time. Can you tell me 1 or 2 things you think should be changed?
Yeah.
It helps me make the sim better next time, but I think it also conveys to them some humility on my part, that I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to change. And it has a reparative quality, I think, which is they feel like, okay, she's listening, and that sim didn't go well, but she's willing to fix it for the next person. And so I try to temporarily put my wounded feelings aside, and then later I'll go talk to my friend Karen Wynn and
have a cry.
Coffee. I really.
Absolutely. And so it would be lovely to get your perspective about how simulation fits with palliative care. And I know we've gone a bit over time, and thank you for your time. Just where do you think simulation fits with palliative care training and the importance of it from your perspective?
So as we wrap up, Karen, I would say thinking about basic conversation skills of identifying what is important to the patient, and what are their goals, whether it's with respect to pain management, whether it's with respect to how lucid they are in the midst of having their pain managed, whether it's their availability to their family via the location of where they are. We often think of conversational skills as sort of murky and indistinct, and I do think we can create what my colleague Chris Rusin calls readiness plans for conversations with patients. And the way that I would recommend us developing those in simulation is we think about the 2 or 3 key situations where we need those conversations. So, for example, negotiating pain management, listening to what the patient is, how the patient's feeling and what the patient wants, for example. Dealing with conflict among family members. The brother wants A and the sister wants B and the mother wants C. So those might be 2 different situations we want people to be ready for. And then once we have those, we can think about what are the foundational skills that are needed for each one of those conversations. And we can be very rigorous about it, just in the same way we would as what are the foundational skills of putting in an IV. So a foundational skill would be asking open-ended questions. A foundational skill would be mirroring back what the patient says. So these are ways that we can rigorously dissect or enumerate what are the skills that we want people to do in palliative care conversations, and give them the chance to practice them in a rapid cycle, deliberate practice manner. We don't expect them to jump into the deep end of the pool and be able to do it, but we can disaggregate those sub parts of the conversation and start teaching those.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point you said about the rapids, to break it up, because I feel those non-technical communication skills are actually harder than just running a sim based on real hard technical skills. I think that can be much more difficult because people are confronted, they're not sure what to say, and they've got family. And so I think they're one of the harder sims to perhaps to develop and write, and also harder to be part of. So I think, do you recommend just short snippets of a scenario with like one or two just clear objectives, not a
Mhm.
huge, I think.
Yeah. So, for example, and having some little literal practice stations, like you might have for procedural skills. So, at
Yeah.
practice station 1, your job is to ask the patient an open-ended question about X, hear the answer, and paraphrase it back.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
station 1. Station 2 might be you hear arguments from sister and brother, and they're conflicting.
Yeah.
And at that station, your job is to summarize back what you're hearing from sister and what you're hearing from brother, and that's it.
Yes. Yeah, I
So we
see.
disaggregate it such that the foundational skills can be practiced in a way that you would build up micro skills for any psychomotor procedure.
Yeah. No, that's excellent advice. I think I can see a sim coming along just from that idea there. It's been so lovely to talk to you. I could talk to you all day, and I know that you don't have all day. Bye.
Bye.
For sharing that, Sharon. I hope that everyone enjoyed that time with Jenny. Okay, so how about now we'll hear from Stephanie. We'll hear a little bit about her journey into simulation and her experiences with psychological safety, both as a participant and as well as a deliverer of sim, and how her broader education on this topic has shaped how she delivers simulation today. So thank you, Sharon. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much for meeting with us today. What I'd like to talk to you about today is psychological safety and how important that is for participants within SIM and also for our faculty who are delivering SIM. And sometimes this term psychological safety might not be known by everybody. We might be doing psychological safe simulation, but we might not be particularly thinking about it from that exact terminology. So just for our people who are listening, just before I get into the proper questions, I'd just like to know if you can tell us a little bit about what made you so interested and passionate about simulation.
Thanks, Karen. It's great to be here. I think, probably like many sim practitioners, um, I got involved in sim as an educator clinically. I was working in an intensive care unit. I was very interested in education. There was a mannequin in the hospital, and so I was kind of just given this: here's a mannequin, go teach. As most people do, teach advanced life support. So I got into simulation by default because I was really interested in education. And then on my journey, started kind of educating myself a little bit more about simulation as an education tool. It really wasn't until I came down to Mater Education that I focused on it as a technique and a methodology in education and training. And that's where I kind of really honed my skill set and built a much broader understanding the risks of simulation and reflecting about all of those poor participants I'd put through simulation before actually understanding its power, because it has a lot of power from an education tool, but with that power does come some risk.
It does have a lot of power, you're right, within the moment and quite for a long time afterwards. So I guess that's really poignant what we're talking about today. I guess I'd also like to know, was there ever a time where you just didn't like simulation or didn't enjoy simulation from a participant point of view? Can you remember back to any times like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, my first entry, I guess, into simulation was as a participant on an ALS course, and the fear I had around sim was it was really used as an assessment tool, and I felt as an assessment tool aimed to catch me out.
Yes.
So a lot of the things around good educational practice around scaffolding, around formative assessment, I felt upon reflection was really missing back then. It was, throw you in the deep end, see if you can survive. And it was a anxiety riddled experience to
Yes, that is the
simulation.
word. They are
Like,
the two words, anxiety riddled. Yes, agreed. Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, I was not a lover as a participant, and when I first started as a sim practitioner, without the skills, I very much drew on the fear that I had as a participant, and sort of tried never to make participants feel like
Yeah.
that.
I ask you that because I think, did you ever have a negative experience? That would have been my next question in simulation, and you have answered that question, I guess, about feeling tricked or feeling like you're being challenged and assessed. And I think that does reflect perhaps simulation, whether it was in its novice period in hospitals or whether it's just that when you came across it. But would you say that that was one of your most negative experiences in simulation, was being tricked or challenged or assessed, or was there something else you can tell us about?
I think that, I don't think that the educators at the time were trying to trick me at
Mm,
all. I definitely don't think it was intentional. I think
mm,
that it was through lack of um, understanding of good practice when running
yes.
sims. And I don't think um, just because it was an assessment was the
A
negative
negative.
experience either,
Mm,
because I think simulation has a valid place in assessment.
mm,
I think it is all about the preparation,
yes.
and that was not done well. And
Mm,
and there's a lot we've learnt in the simulation community, particularly simulation in healthcare community,
mm.
around how we best prepare participants for um, simulation activity.
That leads me perfectly to my next question, which is what we're talking about today, psychological safety. Can you tell me what psychological safety means to you? What's your definition of it?
Well, I think, over the time practicing as both a simulation educator and a simulation participant,
Mm,
we are asking participants to do things that are uncomfortable. We're
mm,
asking them to learn, and learning in front of people is
mm,
uncomfortable. It's a change
mm,
process. We're asking them to practice on the edge of their um, knowledge, their skill
mm.
set, their comfort zone. We're asking them to do all of these really scary things, and
Yes.
that involves risk. So we know
Mm,
psychological safety is about the comfort of taking interpersonal risk,
mm.
and without fear of kind of repercussions, I guess. So to me, in education, and this is certainly what I've learned a lot in working with the Centre for Medical Simulation and Jenny
Mm,
Rudolph, is around building learning environments that are challenging yet safe. So,
mm.
so in the sim world, it's called building the safe container. But building a psychologically safe learning environment doesn't mean it's easy.
So when does psychological safety start?
Well, I mean, I think
Mm,
psychological
mm.
safety is a state we should
Yeah,
all be in. We should be
all the
doing it
time.
all of the time. And
Mm,
we have found this particularly in simulation is
mm,
you have to be congruent in the way
mm,
you act outside of a simulation
mm,
activity, to the way you act if it's in clinical practice or if it's
mm,
in a different education session. Because if you aren't able to sort of have this sense of psychological safety with people outside of a sim center, and then they come and they see you as the educator in the sim center, it
mm.
it doesn't work. There
That's a
needs
good
to
point.
be
Mm,
congruence and authenticity to it. So in answer to your question, when it starts, I think it's something we always should be doing,
mm.
um, but quite practically at the beginning of your session.
Yeah.
Psychological safety, or building the safety safe container, is made up of a couple of things. It's made up of ensuring we have a transparent learning process for participants. It's ensuring we
Mm,
demonstrate respect for them. It's giving them logistical details, like where to
mm.
be. Have you ever turned up to an education session and start fretting because you don't know where the classroom is? it's
Yes,
it's
yeah.
some of those basic sort of Maslow hierarchy of needs
Mm,
type activities.
mm,
It's in sim talking to them about a fiction contract. What does it mean to
mm.
engage in a simulation activity?
Yes.
Recognizing that that's hard.
Mm,
The mannequins don't necessarily look the same as a patient.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Just thinking now about the novice nurse who's perhaps running their first couple of sims, or even someone who's been doing sims for a little while. What would be your advice if you see perhaps in the simulation itself, or I could combine two questions here, in the post brief or the debrief, participants not perhaps treating each other safely, and we've all been there. What's your advice to me, the faculty member who's just sitting there watching that? How do I get things back on track if I haven't done this too many times before?
Yeah, well, I
Mm,
think I think that's why you need to spend the time in the
mm,
pre-brief,
mm.
really establishing what it means to respect each other as learners.
Yes, good point.
So that would be my first point. For me, if that comes up, I often think, when I reflect on my own practice, I think, what didn't I do right at the beginning that led to
Mm,
this?
yeah.
The other thing that I would say is that it does need to be addressed in the moment, because I
Mm,
have sometimes let it go, like just tried to ignore it and hope that the sort of argument between two different people in a
sides.
debrief
Yeah.
sort of just stops, and it doesn't. It just kind of
Mm,
m-
weaves
festers
through.
and
Mm,
continues, and it kind of derails your debriefing. So, look, I have sort of specific phrases in my toolbox as a sim educator for moments like that. So I might say, um, you know, let's say, Karen, it's you
mm,
and
mm.
another person called Sally. Let's just
Yeah.
use those two names. I
Yeah.
might say, Karen and Sally, it seems like there's some difference of opinions about um, this, you know, whatever it might be. Um, Perhaps we just put that to the side for the moment, and the three of us can talk about that after it, or if it's an issue, or let's discuss it now as a group, because it's less about you as individuals and more about this practice as a team. So I, in my head, call this name it to tame it. So
All
I
right.
think you have to name the dynamic.
That just does lead to my next question. You have excellent segues you keep providing for me here, Stephanie, I must say. With our courses, it's focused on palliative care. And so often our simulations can be quite confronting, and it's a lot of non-technical skills involved with communication and difficult conversations. If, again, doesn't matter how much experience I have, I'm in a debrief and I have a very upset participant or a number of participants, do you have any advice for me about how to ensure that the debrief continue to occur, because it's essential for everybody to have that?
I think, well, first of all, it's getting some training in debriefing is important.
Yeah.
Certainly for us at Marta Education, we spend a lot of time focusing on training people
Mm,
in how to debrief. There is
yeah.
certain frameworks to use.
Mm,
The Some work out of another colleague at Centre for Medical Simulation, Laura Rock. She always
mm,
talks about this idea of emotion before cognition. So in
mm.
a debrief, you really always need to start with giving participants time to have a reaction,
Emotion. Yes.
and
Yes.
whether or not that is just simply asking the question, how are we all feeling now,
Mm,
and give them a moment to feel, to label it. If they're too upset, generally we would say, look, Karen, uh, I can see that you're crying.
mm,
Um, I'm worried this might not be the right time to continue the debrief for you.
mm.
Give them options. So
Okay.
acknowledge, give them choices, and then talk about it. That's generally the way I kind of um,
Manage it.
manage it. But
Mm,
I also, again, will harp back to the setting up of the simulation.
mm.
So setting it up, understanding that there's a trigger warning. So usually we will say, look, this scenario, um, comes with risks.
Right. No, thank you so much. I think it's just so important that, whether we know these things or not, it's just good to have a conversation about really setting up the
Yeah.
scenarios and the simulations from the very beginning to be a psychologically safe space, so that people don't run from seeing
If
a
people have poor experiences, then they take that into the next couple.
That's right. Well, they don't
So
come
yeah,
back, or they run
they
away
don't
from
come
you.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we don't want. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I know you're a busy lady. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steph.
See you, Karen.
Bye. Bye. We won't go through the whole thing. Obviously, we're aware of time. So you can find it here on our LMS under the PCC4U. There's a guide to simulation for educators. When you go in, you will need to log in definitely to the LMS to access. You'll see it here, and it's just a little pre-brief of who the module's for. And it's broken into sections, as you can see: getting started, delivering sims, debriefing, and some other considerations for you to think about when you're writing sims, delivering sims, or preparing for a simulation. So what we might have a look at, why don't we have a look at, the ingredients for what makes a successful simulation. Have a little look through. So just using some text, videos, podcasts, and reflections and knowledge that's come from other experts delivering simulation across the globe, we've managed to put together a simulation guide that just touches on all the key concepts that you need when you are thinking of starting sim, or if you're already delivering simulation. So there's some really great podcasts to listen to. There's some really great videos to watch of Jenny. So it's designed in a way that the reader, you can come in and out of different chapters depending on what you're interested in, but it does chronologically follow just a scaffolding approach on building your knowledge on simulation if some of these concepts are new to you. And so we do start at what's important to get right at the beginning, all the way through to how to develop some excellent moments for your learners. There's different activities, and there's a lot of the key buzzwords you'll come across in simulation that sometimes people use, and you may not have come across those terminologies before. Again, you're probably practicing and doing those things, but perhaps it's the terminology that you haven't heard before. So why don't we have a little look at confederates, using confederates. You'll sometimes hear this term. You'll also hear the word embedded simulated participants or patients. I've got a little chapter in here on using confederates in your sim. What's the point of using embedded simulation participants or patients, and why we do it. Some of the things that can go wrong when you do that, and some of the considerations you need to make before you involve a confederate or an ESP into your sim. So we've got some great resources there that we've found that have been very helpful for other people that other people have engaged with to help with training. So we hope that you enjoy some of those things there. Debriefings are obviously a large section, and that's a big part of what we've talked about today. We talk about hot, cold debrief, things to get right at the beginning of the debrief, ways to debrief, plus delta debriefing, as Jenny mentioned. You may have remembered her mentioning there. Just talking about different concepts and different ways to do your debrief. It's not an exhaustive list. Of course, there's millions of different ways to run debrief, to prepare for sims, to write sims, but it's just a real introductory guide for people who are wanting to just immerse themselves into simulation and not sure where to get started. We can also show you some of the PCC4U resources that we have that are based on simulation as well. It's under the Resources for You tab. And we have a video simulation here. You can see this is just an image about a patient called Jeff, and it's about symptom management of his pain. And so there's a simulation that involves students managing Jeff, and one scenario is where the objectives are met for the patient, and one scenario is where the objectives are not met for the patient. And so there's some guides to how to use that simulation to embed that into some of your training and teaching. We also have a short presentation by Linda Carnew, all about the outcomes of an approach that was used to with students here at QUT to use some of our PCC4U resources, one of our simulation stories, to embed simulation into the training and the outcomes that were experienced by the students who use that. So it's got some great learnings in there as well, and can give you a little indicator of how the resources could be used. So again, not an exhaustive list. I anticipate that we'll add to this guide. We're really looking forward to any feedback if you do get a chance to use the guide, and we'll continue to build on the guide as we go. And again, starting point for anybody wanting to get into simulation. I would like to thank you very much for listening today. We will pop up a little poll into the chat about today's simulation. Really hope that you've enjoyed the session and hearing from our speakers. They're great wealth of knowledge that they can share with us. I hope that it's generated some thinking points about the delivery of simulation in your workplace and the development of your own skills or the skills of any faculty that you lead. Again, please let us know if you have any feedback on the guide if you do use it. And we hope to see you at the next webinar on June 21st. But in the meantime, please stay on the line if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss with us today. We'll be staying here for a bit.